So let's start by taking a look at my project. This is my site. It's hosted on GitHub Pages. So you can see the name right there. I imagined that I was working for an HR department at a company, something that theoretically I might be doing someday, and that I was designing a page that would orient new employees. It would give them a little bit of a sense of the company, and then the idea is they could watch a video about what it's like to work at the company and then take a quiz to see if they understood best practices and that kind of thing. So here you have my page, just some information about the company. Obviously, this is all made up. And then you can click on this button and it will reveal this training video and then some instructions. Let's pretend, obviously you can watch this. Blah, blah, blah. Pause that. Pretend we watched the whole thing. And then, okay, you feel like you know what's happening and you take the quiz. So here's my quiz, 3 made-up questions about the office. And let's see. Okay, so is Michael Scott the world's best boss? I'm going to say yes. This one, and yes. And let's submit and see how we did. Oh, you got 2 out of 3. Maybe you should watch the video again. Okay, well, I'm not going to do that, but I will show you that it works if these are all the right answers, and if you submit, it tells you perfect score, great job. Okay, so that's basically what I did. And now let's go take a look at some of my code. It's over here for now. So here's my HTML. You can see I did this using Bootstrap and hopefully formatted it very nicely. I think I did my best. So I used some lists, I used rows and columns, which weren't super necessary since I was not planning on having this change in any responsive way. But I found that if you didn't use rows and columns, you didn't get some of that built-in Bootstrap formatting, so things did not necessarily look as nice. So it was kind of easier just to use them. Otherwise, I was going to wind up doing more custom formatting. You can see I used some buttons. I used this button default button large, which gets you this nice big button. I have some IDs, and here's my embedded video. And I don't really have any functions running in my HTML because I did that differently this week. Let's take a look at my JavaScript for a second. I wanted things to happen on click, and instead of calling them within the button, I used built-in listeners that would listen for the click and run the function instead. I liked that a bit better, actually. I found that it was easier to not have to go back and forth between the HTML and the JavaScript as much, to just sort of have it all work in one place. Obviously, I still had to check IDs and things like that, but I just still found it to be a little more streamlined in my thinking process. So one of the first things I did actually was I created this. Let's refresh this for a sec. I created this part of the page where I had the video and the quiz button start out hidden. And so that is actually in my styles. That's in my CSS. Let's go over here. And you will see that I did that right here, this div tech etiquette 101 display none. That is what tells it that everything in that div, which is both the video and the take the quiz button are in that div, should be hidden on load. So that was very easy. I was able to find out how to do that very quickly. And then I wrote the function to reveal them on click. And that is this function. So here you have my query selector, which finds my video button by ID. So you got that little hash. And then it adds the event listener, which on this event, click, it runs this function, which is find this part of the page and set the style display to block. And so that is what reveals it. This, I believe, Jin did something with this in the to-do list, maybe? I feel like this was I originally found like part of this, or I found something similar in Jin's code, and something I missed at first was this idea that this whole function is called within these parentheses. So at first I was having trouble with this, and it was literally only because I didn't quite catch this formatting. So once I figured that out, this was actually pretty straightforward, which was a nice way to start. It's nice to start with something that you can accomplish without too much banging your head against the wall, because I felt like it gave me confidence to keep going and tackling trickier parts of the page. So then I decided to create my array of test questions. And so I did it like this, where I have my array, and inside my array I have 3 objects, and each object has an ID, and a question, and options, and an answer. And I did not wind up using this ID, interestingly. I could imagine ways I might have used it, but it just didn't wind up happening. And then one thing I had to remember to do was escape some characters. And one thing that caused me a little bit of trouble at one point was I had a typo in proprietary, so my options and my answer didn't match. So I had like solved all these problems, and it was still a little weird. Could never get 3 out of 3 until I caught that typo. So it's funny, the things that will trip you up sometimes. So here's my main function. This is what I spent the bulk of my time working on. And I really tried to do it piece by piece. And this is really where I used console. Use the console, and here, let's get this more nicely. I used the console and the debugger a ton. I could never have accomplished this, especially without even just the console, because I was able to test things out and do it piece by piece. So I created my array, and then first what I tried to do was just have it print out my quiz questions. I didn't try to have quiz questions and answers. I just did the questions. So I wrote something very similar to this, which was a for loop. And I looked at Jin's to-do list to sort of get a sense of how to build the list, because I knew that it was going to be similar. I wanted 3 questions. I wanted them to be numbered. So I was able to look at that and figure that out. And I felt like I understood for loops pretty well, so that wasn't super tricky. And then I printed it out to this element, which I declared at the top of the page. And that worked. That actually took less time than I thought it would, and was pretty straightforward. Then I needed to add in my my answers. That was a bit trickier. So at first I was declaring this variable also at the top. And it turned out that when I did that, it basically sort of just confused my loop. It was hard to do this second built-in loop. And what was happening is that it would print out question 1 and print out 4 answers. And then it would print out question 2 and print out 8 answers. And then it would print question 3 and print out 12 answers. And so that was one of the first times I spent a long time using the debugger. Oh, and this was actually before I did this as a loop. I did it where this was a loop, and I just had all of the questions, the answers sort of added on with each of them. Hard to describe, but basically I tried to do this in blocks so I wouldn't get too overwhelmed and feel like I couldn't ever figure it out. I tried to just accomplish a little bit at a time, and that worked a lot better for me. The trickiest part, the thing that I think where I absolutely needed the debugger and also the console the most, was when I was using the loop and creating the second part of the loop that would both look up the place in the array and loop through each object. So where I needed I to stand for the position in the array and J to stand in for the position in the options array, which is part of my array. So like you have the quiz array, which is the whole thing, and then in each object, you have another array, which is the answer options. And so this is my second loop. Like the first loop is, find question 1. And then after it finds question 1, it loops through and prints out each of these. And then it finds question 2, etc. So I needed that second for loop to loop through the options array. So this function totally works, but it is inefficient, which is what I have in my notes here. What it does is it loops through, it finds question 1, and it then loops through all the answers, and it saves those to my 2 variables, quiz HTML and multiple HTML, and then I append those to the inner HTML, which prints them out. But it still has them saved in these variables. And when I then loop through question 2, it doesn't replace the values of these variables, it appends the new values. So really, each time this prints, it's replacing what was printed before, but it contains more information. So it's like, first it's printing out question 1 answers A, B, C, D. Then it's printing out question 1, A, B, C, D, question 2, A, B, C, D. Then it's printing out question 1, A, B, C, D, question 2, A, B, C, D, question 3, A, B, C, D. Obviously, ideally, it would be the most efficient for it to either just print once and print everything, or to print 3 times and print just one question at a time. I just couldn't really work on it anymore. I was sort of done, and since it worked, I decided to accept it. But that was like, I may come back to it another day because it's definitely bugging me, but I think maybe even tomorrow because I have a little time left. But for now, I'm happy with it. I'm happy with how I got it to work, so I'm not going to stress too much about it. Let's see. Oh, and then the last part of the page, obviously, is just to add event listeners to the check quiz button, which is that last button. We can take a quick look. And loop through and add up the scores and return different alerts depending on how people scored. This was both trickier and easier than I expected it to be. So I wound up learning a bunch about string literals, which Jen had told us a little bit about, but I think I just never quite understood. So this, in one of the live sessions, this came up, and I thought he straightforwardly told us how to do this. And he had, it was just that I was a little bit confused about the difference between backticks and single quotation marks. So I got really screwed up by tiny details here, and it took, first, this is where I really used the console to print out different values. First, I didn't have it. I was like, well, we'll just put in what I want. I'll put in the ID of the answer that I want, and we'll just see if I can get it to print it out correctly. And once I was able to do that, once I could look up the checked value of a question, that's what this does. Sorry, I should have said that before. This assigns to a variable the value of the checked radio button at this name. So we can look. Well, this is basically, you'll see it gets printed out. Each radio button has a name, which is based on its location in the object. And then the value is the same as, the value is equal to the HTML that gets printed out. So this takes that value and it reports the one that is checked, the answer that people have selected. And these backticks tell the computer, or tell my JavaScript or my HTML that I'm going to have something that is not a string, that I'm going to have a variable, essentially, in here. And this is how I indicate that. But by having backticks, I don't have to have a million parentheses, so it's much easier. Did not feel easier when I was trying 70 different versions of this, but I did eventually figure it out. So the console was super useful for that. And then what was easier than I expected was just sort of basically the if else. This is another funny coding lesson. At first I had this set as answer one equals quiz, bracket I dot answer, which of course was just setting a new value to the answer. So it seemed like when I checked it in the console, because I like to do that first, and so I get an undefined to see if there aren't any obvious errors, it looked like it worked because I was just setting a new value. But it wasn't really doing anything, so of course it didn't actually work. But I figured that out pretty quickly, and that's what led me to realize that I was just not doing this. First, I changed it to so it would be checking whether those values were equal and not setting a new value to the variable. And then I realized that this was totally not working, and that's what led me into this deep dive of how exactly do I select this part of my HTML that is being generated by a different function. So I decided that basically if they got a perfect score, they would get one message, and if they didn't get a perfect score, they would get a different message. I could obviously also have gone on to clear the answers, for example, if they didn't get a perfect score. And in the real world, I'm sure I would have people log into this page so they could get credit for their work. But that is all work for another day. It has been a really great class for me. I feel like I've learned a ton. And I think I will actually weirdly miss doing all this programming.